filed the incident report on a Tuesday, standard government form, blue ink, 3 copies. In the box marked, nature of threat I wrote, aggressive root system, extraterrestrial origin, contained. In the box marked resolution method. Topical application of synthesized industrial solvent compound introduced at embryonic node. In the box marked casualty count, I put the number and initialed it, and did not look at it again for a long time. The man who processed the form, a tired GS9 clerk's FEMA annex outside what used to be Portland, read it twice, looked up at me, looked back down, and stamped it closed. That was the end of it, officially. Unofficially, I still wake up some nights hearing the sound the ground made when it moved. I should start at the beginning, though I am not entirely sure where the beginning actually is. If you want a clean line, draw it here. 3 years before the seeding, I was a xenobotanist working for Joint Human Galactic Science Consortium operating out of a research station in the Cascades. My official title was Senior Researcher, Alien Botanical Biology, which sounds more impressive than it was. My job was to study off-world plant biology, seeds, spores, germination chemistry, root architecture, the metabolic systems by which alien plant life converts energy and processes soil. The kind of work that sounds dull at dinner parties, and is in fact exactly as dull as it sounds most of the time. I had a lab that smelled of agar and calibration fluid. I had a spectrometer that required weekly recalibration and held a grudge about it. I had a graduate assistant named Chen who made terrible coffee and was quietly brilliant at root structure imaging, the kind of brilliant that didn't talk much and let the data do it for him. And I had a colleague named Jeremy Frame. That last item is the one that matters. So I will be fair to him, because fairness is the only thing I can still give him. Frame was a xenobiologist, older than me by a decade, with the kind of credentialing that gets you invited to alien symposiums, and the kind of ego that eventually gets you uninvited from them. He was brilliant in the specific way that certain brilliant people are, completely, and dangerously, and without the moderating influence of doubt. He believed with a conviction that even at the time, as being closer to faith than to science, that the galactic community had been systematically withholding the scope of their deep archive biological technology from human researchers. He was not wrong about that. The Galactic Consortium, the Sluice Federation of species that had been coordinating interstellar contact protocols since before humans had figured out agriculture, did withhold things, many things, more things than we knew as it turned out. Frame was wrong about almost everything else, including, most critically, what they were withholding it for. He found a broker, a Veth dissident, which is a category of being I had not known existed until it became professionally relevant to me. The Veth, I'll come to them properly in a moment, maintain a library of biological material that they call the Preservation Archive. Their word for it translates roughly as the record of what was, which should have been a warning to anyone paying attention to galactic linguistics. Frame had apparently been corresponding with this dissident for 2 years before I knew anything about it. And the dissident, who Frame called Marcos, a name I adopted in my own notes, because the actual Veth designation required a tonal range I do not have, was willing to sell. Frame did not know, or chose not to investigate, was what exactly he was buying. Frame brought the canister to the station on a Wednesday morning in October. I remember the morning specifically because the Cascades were clear after a week of rain, and the ridgeline to the east was sharp and white, and there was the particular stillness that comes after storms when the air hasn't decided what to do next. He came to my lab and showed me the canister. Matte gray, about the size and weight of a thermos, stamped with Veth containment markings that covered its entire exterior surface. The markings were dense. You did not need to read Veth notation fluently to understand. Understand that a container that thoroughly marked was marked for a reason. I told him I wouldn't help him open it. He looked at me for a moment with the particular expression he used when he encountered an inconvenient answer. Not anger exactly, more a kind of patient recalibration, as if he were adjusting his expectations of a piece of equipment that had given an unexpected reading. And he said he understood. Then, he left. I wrote him a formal memo, recommending he surrender the sample to the consortium clearinghouse. for cataloging and proper analysis under controlled conditions. I sent it to his office address, his personal inbox, and the station director. The station director forwarded it to Frame with a note saying he agreed with my assessment. Frame filed it. I know he filed it because I found the memo in his records later, stamped, received, and annotated in his handwriting with the single word, considered. He opened the canister 2 weeks later, alone, in a field 2 miles south of the station, at dawn, with no protective equipment, no containment protocols, and no witnesses, which I believe was intentional, because Frame understood at some level that what he was doing required the absence of people who would stop him. The seed was the size of a fingernail. He described it later. In the notes I read at his compound, pearl gray, slightly translucent, harder than it looked, with a faint surface texture like compressed fiber. He placed it in a prepared soil sample. He had dug a small hole, a proper germination bed, which tells you that even at his most reckless Frame was still a scientist. And he covered it, and he stood back, and he waited. First root emerged from the soil 11 minutes later. By the time he understood what he was watching, the root was 40 feet long and driving north. He ran. He had a vehicle and a head start, and the instincts of a man who had spent enough years in the field to recognize when field conditions had exceeded the scope of the original plan. He reached his compound in the mountains, and he locked the door, and he watched the growth on his remote sensors. And I believe he spent the next 6 days, hoping it would stop on its own. The way a person hopes for something they already know isn't coming. I didn't know any of this when it started. I was in my lab doing calibration on the spectrometer, a task I had been putting off for 3 days. When the station alert system fired, I stepped outside and looked south toward the ridgeline, and I saw the ground moving. That is still the most accurate way I have to describe it. The ground moving, not the earthquake's random chaos. I grew up in the Northwest. I know what earthquakes feel like. But directional movement, purposeful, the soil rising in long parallel ridges as something massive drove through it from below. The ridges were advancing. As I watched, a lodgepole pine at the south edge of the tree line tilted, held for a moment at an angle that defied gravity in the way that things do in the last second before they stop defying it. And then it went down, the root ball torn from the earth, and the trunk hitting the ground with a sound I felt in my sternum. I went back inside and got my field kit, my spectrometer, my laptop, and the emergency hard drive where I kept my off-world botanical reference library. I thought briefly about my coffee. I left it. Taylor was in the parking lot when I got there. Government agent. The agency was never fully specified, which is a category of answer I have learned over the years to interpret as deliberate. Tall, with the calm manner of a man who has prepared extensively for bad situations, and finds bad situations less alarming than civilians do, because he understands what bad looks like. And this was not yet the worst he had seen. He had seen worse since, I think. He showed me his identification quickly and put it away. You're Snow, the xenobotanist. Yes, do you know what that is? He was looking south at the moving ground. Not specifically. Not yet. Frame, my colleague Jeremy Frame, acquired an untologged Veth botanical sample 2 weeks ago. I wrote a memo recommending he not open it. I paused. I believe he opened it. Taylor processed this without visible reaction. Frame is missing. Can't raise him. I know where he probably is. I can tell you later. Now, do you have people in the field? He did. 2 environmental monitors, Joe Marsh and Kate Villanueva, who had been doing a routine survey of the Cascade foothills when the growth started and had gone toward it rather than away from it, because that is what competent field monitors do, and were now pinned in a ranger station approximately 3 miles into the advancing root zone. Taylor had a vehicle and needed someone who could tell him what he was driving into. I got in. The root system was faster than it looked from a distance. Up close, with the ground erupting on both sides of the road, and the tremor running continuously through the chassis of the truck, fast was the only word that fit. Taylor drove well. I noticed that, because driving well in those conditions required a kind of non-panic decision-making that not everyone has access to under pressure. And we reached the ranger station with the leading root edge 40 feet from the perimeter and closing. Joe had the good sense to have their gear already loaded. Kate had her camera running, and had been running it since the start, which was how I learned about the footage. We got them out in 4 minutes, the root tendrils tracking the heat signatures of the engine, and we drove north, with the ground buckling in the rear view. I watched Kate's footage that night, in a FEMA forward staging area outside Salem. She had 48 hours of material, methodical, well shot, the kind of documentation that understands its own value. And I watched the first 6 hours twice and made notes. She told me several things that I needed to know, and one thing I did not expect. The roots were not simply consuming what they encountered. It was a pause, systematic brief, 2 to 3 seconds in most instances, before the root mass engaged with any new structure or material type. During this pause, the leading tendrils made contact, held, and then either drove forward into the material or routed around it. I watched a transformer housing on the edge of the ranger station property, a galvanized steel cabinet, old and corroded, receive the leading tendril, hold the contact for 6 seconds, and then watch the tendril pull back. The root mass went around the housing entirely. When it hit the wooden wall of the station 5 feet away, it went through in 45 seconds. I noted this. I noted the chemical treatment on old galvanized steel. I thought about it. The second thing Kate's footage showed me was the route patterns. In the first 24 hours of the event, before the root system had established the primary network, there were gaps. Not random gaps. The growth had avoided certain areas. A tire salvage yard on the south edge of a county road, a pond at the base of an old mill property that had a distinctive dark color from decades of runoff, a stretch of highway shoulder near a decommissioned chemical transfer station, had come within touching distance of each and pulled back. They had not assessed and driven through. They had assessed and retreated. Chemicals, specific compounds, a consistent avoidance behavior. I wrote this down and underlined it, and then I went to find the Veth xenobotany literature I had downloaded to my emergency drive. All of it, every paper the consortium had permitted human researchers to access, which was not much and was, I now understood, precisely calibrated to be not much. What I had was a partial picture. It was more than I'd had an hour ago. Let me explain the Veth. Because understanding what they were sending against us matters for understanding why it didn't work. The Veth are among the oldest spacefaring species in the region of the galaxy humans have begun to map. When I say old, I do not mean the way historians use the word. I mean geologically old, cosmologically patient, a civilization that thinks in timescales that make the span of human recorded history look like a rounding error. They are not malevolent, exactly. Malevolence implies emotion, and the Veth have emotion the way mountains have weather. It is present, but it is not the primary feature, and it does not rush. They move slowly, consider slowly, and when they make a decision, they make it once and commit to it entirely. Their biological archive, the Preservation Library, is not, as Frame believed, a collection of botanical curiosities. It is a weapons cache. The politest way to say it, which is the way the consortium's diplomatic language was carefully structured to imply without stating, is that the Veth maintains certain biological instruments developed for planetary management. The least polite way to say it is that they have a library of tools for ending worlds, and they have been adding to that library for longer than our species has had a name. A Cascade Seed is the instrument they use when they have decided that a world needs to be cleared. The seed contains the germination blueprint for a root architecture that, once established in viable soil, propagates a network that rewrites the planet's soil chemistry from the ground up, progressively replacing native biological systems with the Cascade root network, converting the planet's carbon and mineral base into a form compatible with Veth terraforming. It is not a fast process by human standards. A full planetary cascade takes between 40 and 80 years on a world of Earth's mass. But the Veth are not in a hurry. They have never needed to be in a hurry. The cascade is autonomous, self-sustaining, and self-repairing. Once seeded, a planet does not require further Veth intervention. The seed does the work. 11 worlds had been Cascade seeded in the past 200,000 years of Veth records accessible to human researchers. These records did not describe what those worlds had been before the Cascade. There were no before records. There was only the after. 11 planets, currently in various stages of Veth terraforming, one impotent work in progress, that would not be complete for decades or centuries to come. The Veth had never, as far as I could determine from the available literature, needed to send a second seed to any of them. I sat with this, in the FEMA staging area at 2 in the morning, with the distant sound of the emergency broadcasts on the television in the main tent, and the periodic deep vibration that was the root system working somewhere under the ground. And I thought about what it meant that the Veth had seeded a Class 12 Deathworld, and what it meant that the seed was showing avoidance behaviors near human industrial contamination zones, and what it meant that the Veth had presumably known. Had to have known. Their xenobiological records were among the most comprehensive in the galactic community. What class of world they were targeting. It meant that either they had decided a Class 12. Deathworld was no different from any other world the Cascade had consumed. Or they had not tested this assumption, or they had tested it, and it had not come out the way the test suggested it would. Any of these three possibilities left the same gap, and the gap was where I intended to go. Taylor authorized the field research status that let me requisition equipment from the FEMA logistics chain, which is a sentence I would not have expected to write 6 months prior, but which described exactly what happened over the following 72 hours. He also told me where Frame's compound was, which he had determined through channels he did not describe. And he told me Frame had made contact and wanted to deal. I need his notes, I told Taylor. Whatever he observed in the first days, before he went to ground, the root system's behavior, growth rates, depth readings, avoidance patterns if he noticed them. He noticed them, Taylor said. He was reading something on his phone. He's been calling them anomalies. In his notes.
He would.
Frame would call them anomalies because they didn't fit his model of what the seed should do, and Frame's instinct when reality contradicted his model was to label the contradiction rather than revise the model. It was his worst professional habit, and his most human one. Get me to his compound. We went the long way, because the direct route had 2 sections where the root mass had consumed the highway entirely. Not just cracked it, consumed it. The tarmac pulled apart and dragged down into the soil, like a tablecloth being pulled off a table. And the alternative routing took us 3 hours on logging roads through country that was still intact but vibrating continuously. The subterranean hum of the root network, a constant presence through the vehicle's floor. Frame looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of what he had done for 3 weeks without putting it down once. He was thinner. He had the eyes of someone who had not slept well since October. He handed me his research notebooks without being asked, and without making any conditions, which was not the Frame I remembered 3 years of 3 shared station work. And he sat in the corner of the compound's main room, and did not speak while I read. He had been thorough. Whatever else Frame was, thoroughness was never a question. He had documented the root system's growth rate, which averaged 60 feet per hour in optimal soil conditions, faster in the river valleys, slower in rocky terrain and in areas with high mineral content in the subsoil. He had documented the primary taproot's depth progression, which had reached 40 meters below the surface within the first week, and continued driving down. He had mapped the root density patterns, identified the communication signals the network used to coordinate its expansion. The same electrochemical pulse signaling found in Earth's mycorrhizal fungal networks, scaled up by orders of magnitude and running with the precision of engineered systems rather than evolved ones. And in the back of the notebook, in a section he had labeled anomalies. Unexplained, he had documented 23 instances of avoidance behavior, 23 sites where the root mass had approached, made contact, and retreated. He had mapped them carefully, noted the surface characteristics of each location, noted the soil type, noted the land use history where he could determine it. He had written, pattern unclear, possibly mineral content, possibly moisture variation, possibly electromagnetic. He had not thought of chemistry, not the right kind. I read the anomaly section 3 times. Then I looked up at Frame, who was watching me from his corner. With the expression of a man watching someone, read his confession. You mapped these precisely, I asked, to within 50 meters. And you recorded the land use history for, I checked the entries, at least 14 of them? 15. The other 8 I couldn't get records for in time. I looked at the map again. Tire salvage yard. industrial runoff pond, decommissioned chemical transfer station, contaminated soil remediation site, a place that had been so thoroughly poisoned by prior industrial use that it had been on an EPA watch list for 11 years. Former battery manufacturing facility, old rail yard, the kind that generations of diesel and metal residue had made permanently unwelcoming to normal plant life. The pattern was clear. It had been clear in Kate's footage, and it was clear in Frame's anomaly map, and it was going to be clear in the soil samples I needed to collect from 3 of those sites if the soil samples showed me what I thought they were going to show me. Is not a normal world. That is the foundational fact of the galactic classification system as it pertains to us. A Class 12 death world, which means elevated gravity, elevated radiation, atmospheric chemistry that most species find hostile, and an ambient biosphere of such aggressive complexity that the standard galactic advisory for Class 12 worlds is do not land without full containment protocols. The Class 12 designation captures what evolution did to this planet over 4 billion years. It does not capture what we did to it over the past 200. We have been poisoning our own environment since the beginning of the industrial age. This is not a political observation, it is a chemical one. The soil beneath human industrial civilization carries compounds that have no natural analog anywhere in the galactic biological record. Heavy metal concentrations from 2 centuries of manufacturing, synthetic polymer chains from plastics production, organochlorine residues from agricultural and industrial chemical use, petroleum derivatives in soil saturations that would be classified as mass extinction events on biospheres that had not evolved in the presence of crude petroleum from the beginning. The Veth Cascade Seed had been engineered to consume living worlds. It had been tested over 200,000 years against 11 worlds. Those 11 worlds were presumably what the Veth expected worlds to be: complex living biospheres, rich in organic chemistry, full of the carbon and mineral cycles that the Cascade root network was designed to exploit for energy and mass conversion. None of those 11 worlds, I was willing to bet everything I had on it, had been Class 12 death worlds that had also spent 2 centuries industrializing. The Cascade root network operated on an electrochemical signaling system. Its roots communicated position, growth directives, resource allocation, all of it running through a distributed biochemical network that required a specific and consistent chemical environment to function correctly. The signal system was not robust to interference. It was not designed to be robust to interference, because on a normal world there would be no interference. The soil chemistry of a normal living world is complex but within predictable parameters. The signal system had never needed to account for organochlorine contamination from a decommissioned pesticide plant, because no world the Cascade had ever touched had had a decommissioned pesticide plant. The compounds in Earth's contaminated zones were not killing the roots. They were doing something more effective. They were rendering the root network's communication system incoherent, static. The electrochemical signals that the network used to coordinate its expansion could not propagate through soil, saturated with those compounds. The roots in the affected zones lost contact with the rest of the network. They could not receive growth directives. They could not report resource availability. They could not synchronize their expansion with the broader network. In those zones, the Cascade was effectively deaf and blind, and the Cascade's response to sensory deprivation, I now understood, was retreat. The network was engineered to advance into viable territory, not to fight through hostile conditions. It had never encountered hostile conditions before. It had no protocol for them, so it went around. I told Taylor what I had concluded, standing in Frame's compound with the notebooks in my hands, and the compound maps on the table and the distant constant vibration frame of the root system running through the floorboards. You're saying it can't survive in poisoned ground, he said. I'm saying it was never designed to. The Veth were engineering for normal worlds. This isn't a normal world. I sat down. I can synthesize a compound. Not a perfect one. I don't have the equipment or the time for perfect. But a concentrating and delivery mechanism for the active chemical components already present in the avoidance zones. Package them in a form that can be injected at depth. Introduced directly to the root network's primary node. What's the primary node? The original germination point. The embryonic node. The biological clock for the whole network. It's what coordinates the expansion timing for every root in the system. If the node loses coherence, the network loses coordination. And without coordination, the network's metabolic demand exceeds what the individual root sections can sustain. It doesn't die immediately. It degrades, grows incoherently, collapses under its own resource consumption. I paused. 6 days to synthesize something usable with what I have. Maybe 5. What do you need? Soil samples. 3 sites from Frame's anomaly map. The tire salvage yard, the runoff pond, and the site here. I put my finger on the map. The old remediation site outside Medford. High-pressure, deep injection rig. Agricultural, the kind used for subsoil fertilizer delivery. How deep? 60 meters. Minimum. He was quiet for a moment. The node. Do you know where it is? Within 3 miles of the original germination point. The root density is highest there. The network concentrates resource allocation around the node for protection. If I can get Frame's density maps against the original release location. Frame spoke from the corner without being asked. I have the original location marked. And the density modeling. He didn't look up. Page 47. I turned to page 47. The synthesis took 4 days. I will not pretend it was clean science. It was emergency field work. The kind of work you do when elegance has to yield to necessity. Running the process in a converted trailer that Taylor's had sourced from a university geology survey unit that had been parked at the FEMA staging area and wasn't going anywhere. The spectrometer worked. The concentrating equipment worked after I spent 6 hours troubleshooting a seal failure. The delivery vehicle, a modified agricultural deep injection applicator, the kind normally used to push fertilizer into hardpan soil, was adapted by Joe in a process that involved a lot of profanity and 2 trips to a hardware store that was still operating in a town 20 miles north of the affected zone. Joe turned out to be very good with mechanical adaptation. I had not known this about him. I had known him as a field monitor, a careful documentarian, someone who understood ecosystems and how to observe them without disturbing them. I had not known he could look at a piece of agricultural equipment and a set of specifications and produce a functional deep injection system in 36 hours. He was, it turned out, the kind of person who solves the problem in front of him with whatever is available, which is a trait I came to understand. That week was more specifically human than I had previously considered. Kate ran logistics and documentation. She was still filming. She filmed the synthesis work, the equipment adaptation, the planning sessions, the maps, everything, with the same calm, systematic thoroughness she had brought to the first days in the field. I asked her why she was still documenting when the immediate urgency was so high, and she looked at me with an expression that suggested the question had not occurred to her as a serious one. Because it happened, she said. Someone has to write it down. She was right. Someone did. Frame contributed the calculations I needed for the node location. Specifically, the depth modeling that predicted the embryonic node's exact position based on the primary taproot's descent rate and the directional data from his first week monitoring. He had been thorough enough in those first days, before guilt and fear had taken hold, that his data was good. The node was at approximately 62 meters depth, within a 30-meter horizontal radius of the original release site, which was now inside the highest density root zone, the most heavily defended territory the network had. Getting the injection rig to a point over the node meant going in. There was a monitoring well. Frame mentioned it on the 3rd day of synthesis work, reviewing the geological survey maps for the area. Groundwater monitoring well, drilled 8 years earlier by an EPA survey team, cased in galvanized steel, sunk to 80 meters. It was positioned on a county access road inside the root-dense zone, half a mile north of the original release point. It was designed for exactly the kind of deep access delivery I needed. The well casing was galvanized steel, old and corroded. The same chemical surface signature that Kate's footage had shown the roots retreating from, back at the ranger station transformer housing, told Taylor. He looked at the map for a long time. 4 minutes, I said. In cold conditions, at night, with suppressed heat signatures. The roots track metabolic output, movement, engine heat, body temperature, cold suits and cut engines within 400 meters. We go in quiet, we work fast, we get out. And if it tracks us anyway, then we drive faster than the routes can follow, which we've already demonstrated is possible. He considered this. He had the look he used when he was doing the specific calculation of acceptable risk, that his job required him to do many times, and that I imagine never gets easier, regardless of how many times you do it. Hey, he said. We went in at 2:30 in the morning. Taylor drove. Joe ran the injection rig from the second vehicle. Kate rode with Frame and me. The cold suits from the search and rescue cache were too large for me and smelled of stored rubber, but they worked. The root system's tracking behavior noticeably slowed when we cut the engines and coasted the last 400 meters in the dark with the suits on. The silence of the engine-off approach was something I will not forget. The sound of tires on broken road, the distant low vibration of the root network in the ground, and nothing else. The well was intact. Taylor had the access cover off in 90 seconds. Joe began threading the delivery hose down the casing, the weighted applicator head sinking into the steel tube, the line paying out behind it, 60 meters of depth, reached in 4 minutes. I had 4 canisters. The delivery protocol was sequential. Each canister injected allowed 30 seconds to propagate through the applicator head, then the next. Total delivery time, 6 minutes minimum. In the 4th minute, a root tendril came across the road and touched the well casing. The assessment pause began. 2 seconds. 4, I counted them. The tendril was in contact with the casing, not driving, not retreating, holding. The electrochemical assessment that the network ran on every unfamiliar material contact, running its biological analysis of the surface chemistry. Old galvanized steel, corroded with the specific zinc oxide and metallic compound surface chemistry that had driven the avoidance response in Kate's footage back at the Ranger Station transformer housing. I had calculated that the casing would read correctly. I had not been certain. Certainty was not available that week. At 7 seconds, the tendril pulled back. Root mass routed around the well casing on both sides and continued north. I breathed. We finished the delivery. All 4 canisters, the full compound load, pushed down to 62 meters and dispersed through the applicator head into the soil around the embryonic node. The compound began working on contact. It did not need time to prepare. It was already in its active form. The organochlorine and heavy metal derivatives, already at the concentration required to saturate the node's local soil chemistry and generate the electrochemical static that would disrupt the node's timing signal. We were out in 11 minutes. Taylor ran the engine on the exit. We had to. The root mass was tracking in from both sides on the road out, and outrunning it was the only option. And we drove north with the ground erupting on both sides and the leading tendrils coming within 10 feet of the rear vehicle before the speed differential opened enough distance to breathe. We reached the perimeter at dawn. I sat on the hood of the truck and waited. The subterranean vibration had been continuous for 3 weeks. I had stopped consciously hearing it sometime in the 2nd week. It had become the baseline, the ambient condition of the world, the way traffic becomes ambient to people who live near a highway. Sitting on that truck hood in the early light, I was aware of it specifically for the first time in days. The way you become aware of a sound when it is about to stop. 6:07 in the morning, 42 minutes after we reached the perimeter, it stopped. Not faded, not slowed. Stopped in the space of 2 or 3 seconds, the way an engine stops, here and then gone. The ground under my hand was still. Taylor was standing 20 feet away with his arms crossed and his face aimed at the ground. When the vibration stopped, he did not move for a moment. Then he looked up at me. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. The root system did not die quickly. I had never said it would. What I had said was that the node's failure would propagate through the network over days and weeks. The outer sections losing coordination, the metabolic load of sustaining 6 weeks of aggressive growth, without the timing signal becoming unsustainable. The system eventually consuming more energy than it could generate without the node's resource allocation management. That is what happened, in the order I had described it, at approximately the rate I had estimated. The outer growth stopped advancing on day 8 after the node failure. The root mass began to show desiccation in the outlying sections on day 15. The cellular structure of the root tissue breaking down as the cascade's active chemistry, which had been maintained by the node's continuous electrochemical signal, destabilized. By day 25, the outer sections were visibly dead. By day 35, the primary root mass, the dense interior network that had been the weapon's core, had collapsed into a fibrous residue that the soil began to break down through normal bacterial action, slowly, over the following year. The active compounds in the compound I had synthesized, the organochlorine and heavy metal derivatives concentrated from Earth's own contaminated soil, turned out to be, once introduced to the root tissue itself, straightforwardly toxic to the cascade's cellular machinery. The seed had never been designed to tolerate them from within. It had only been designed to avoid them from without. There is a meaningful difference. Frame surrendered himself on day 16. He did not negotiate. He simply showed up at the FEMA annex and handed Taylor a sealed envelope and sat down. The envelope contained complete documentation of his contact with Marcos, the acquisition of the canister, the circumstances of the release. He included the memo I had sent him, the one stamped received and annotated considered. I do not know if including it was meant as accountability or apology, or simply as completeness. Frame's motivations in those last days were not something I was in a position to interpret clearly. The Galactic Consortium issued a formal response 6 weeks after the node failure. It was a dry diplomatic document that covered a great deal of conceptual ground while saying as little as possible about anything specific. It acknowledged a regulatory failure in the handling of archival library materials. It announced a review of consortium access protocols. It expressed regret for the impact on the affected terrestrial zone and its human population. It did not use the words Cascade Seed. It did not describe what Class 9 meant. It did not mention the 11 worlds. Marcos, the Veth dissident who had brokered the sale, was in consortium custody before any human government could request his extradition. The consortium declined to provide details of what proceedings, if any, had followed. I read the consortium statement twice, on a morning when the cascade root mass in the southern sections was already showing significant desiccation. The formally advancing ridges now gray and still and slowly flattening as the tissue lost structural integrity. I read it the second time slowly. I thought about what it meant that the Veth had Cascade Seeded, a Class 12 Deathworld, without apparent preparation for the possibility that the Class 12 designation might matter. I thought about whether this represented an oversight, an assumption, or a calculated risk that had not calculated correctly. I thought about the fact that the Class 12 Deathworld designation exists because Earth produces organisms capable of surviving conditions that kill most species. It describes the planet's evolved biology. It says nothing about what 2 centuries of industrial civilization have added to that biology's operating environment. The Veth records on Earth were old. Their last comprehensive xenobiological survey of this system had been conducted, as far as I could determine, from the consortium's disclosed research calendar, approximately 300 years before the Industrial Revolution. They had missed 200 years of us poisoning our own ground, and the weapon they had built to clear us had choked on the poison and died. I did not find this funny. I found it informative. The recovery work took longer than the crisis. That is almost always true. And it is the part that does not get documented as thoroughly, because the crisis has urgency, and the recovery has only duration. Chen came back in month 3 and picked up his root structure imaging work with the equanimity of someone who understood that there was more data now, and therefore more work to do, and therefore less time for processing how strange the situation was. He made terrible coffee. The spectrometer still required weekly recalibration. Some things are stable. I spent the better part of 2 years monitoring the soil recovery in the affected zone. The cascade root tissue's breakdown products were complex. Not all of them were biologically neutral, and some of the decomposition chemistry created secondary soil conditions that were unfavorable for native plant reestablishment. The grass came back wrong the first season, pale and sparse, the root systems shallow and stressed. I documented this. I documented the second season's improvements and the third season's return to something approaching normal surface cover. The subsoil is still disrupted in places. The deepest sections of the primary taproot left channels that the groundwater is still rerouting around, which creates localized soil behavior that the agricultural survey teams find inconvenient and interesting in equal measure. Joe and Kate's documentation was published in a joint paper 14 months after the event, significantly redacted, in a consortium-affiliated journal that most human researchers do not have access to. They received an acknowledgement from the FEMA director and an award from an agency whose name I was never told in a ceremony that was not open to observers. The footage Kate had gathered, all of it, 4 terabytes of methodical, careful field documentation, was archived at a security classification of level law I do not have clearance to access. I know this because I requested access and received a response explaining that access was not available. The response was polite. It was stamped with a classification designation I had not seen before. I filed a complaint about the footage classification. The complaint was acknowledged and filed. It has not been acted on. Taylor sent me a message 10 months after the incident. The consortium has agreed to a full audit of Class 9 holdings. 8 words. I read it several times. 8 words and no further context. Which is, I have come to understand, Taylor's preferred unit of communication when the context is classified and the meaning is not. There is a stretch of highway between the station and the nearest town. 4 miles of road that runs through what was, briefly, the edge of the most heavily affected zone. The road crews repaved it twice in the first year. It still sits uneven over the disturbed subsoil, the surface rising and dipping in long, slow waves that you can feel through the car's suspension if you know what to look for. Crews say another year, maybe 2, before the substrate settles enough to hold a proper level surface. I drive it every day. I know every rise and dip by position now, the way you know the specific creaks of a familiar building. Not consciously, but in the body, in the adjustment you make automatically without thinking about it. I know what made each one. The FEMA clerk who processed my incident report, the one I'd filed on that Tuesday, 3 copies, blue ink, retired 8 months after the event. I ran into him in a hardware store in Grants Pass. He recognized me, across the fastener aisle, a small shock of recognition on a face that had been carrying something heavy for 8 months. Talked for a few minutes, standing in the fluorescent light with the hum of the store's ventilation around us. And at the end of it he said, "That form you filed, the one I stamped closed." Yes, he looked at his hands. See, they were the hands of a man who had filed a form that described something he did not have a framework for, and had been living with the absence of a framework ever since. Was it really? I thought about the 11 worlds. I thought about the consortium statement. 8 careful paragraphs of diplomatic language that said nothing. I thought about the soil under my hand on the perimeter at dawn, going still. I thought about what was still out there, in a library somewhere, in an archive of instruments built for planetary management by a civilization that had been making those instruments for longer than we had been making tools. And what the audit of Class 9 holdings would or would not resolve. Mostly, I said. He nodded, the way people nod when an answer is honest, rather than comforting, accepting the honesty, because the comfort was never going to be available anyway. We said goodbye. He went back to his cart. I went back to mine, bought what I needed, drove home on the uneven road, put my hand on the ground sometimes, outside the station in the morning, before I go in, the way I did on the perimeter, the day the vibration stopped. Old habit. The ground is still. It has been still for 2 years. I take my hand away and go in and start the coffee. That is enough. Some mornings it is exactly enough. Some mornings, I know what I am not saying when I say it, and I say it anyway, because there are things that are true and there are things that are useful, and on the best mornings, those are the same thing, and on the others, you make your choice and you go to work. Is a period in the second week that I have not described yet, because describing it requires staying with it longer than I prefer to. And I am aware that preference is not a professional standard. By day 10, the root system had consumed or compromised 240 square miles of Pacific Northwest terrain. The number sounds abstract the way large numbers always sound abstract until you are standing at the edge of the affected zone And looking at what 240 square miles means in practice, it means the Willamette Valley's southern agricultural corridor, most of it the fields and orchards, and the small towns between them, the farmsteads that had been in the same families for 5 generations, and the irrigation infrastructure that had taken a generation to build. It means the road network reduced to a handful of functioning routes that the route mass had not yet reached or had routed around, for reasons I was still working to understand. It means the evacuation camps north of Salem, where 80,000 people were living in structures designed for emergency weather response, not for the weeks of displacement that they were now going into. I drove through the northern edge of the displacement camps on the morning of day 11, going south to collect the soil samples I needed. I drove slowly because the road was shared with the supply vehicles coming in, and I had time to look. I do not want to editorialize about what I saw, because the people in those camps deserve better than to be described through the filter of someone driving through on her way to collect soil samples. But I will say that there is a particular quality to the faces of people who are waiting to find out if they have anything to go back to. And that quality is not despair. Despair comes later, when the answer arrives. But a specific kind of suspension, a held breath that has been held too long. And I drove through it, and it stayed with me in a way that the root system's advance had not. System was a problem I could think about. The faces in those camps were a weight I carried differently. The soil samples were extraordinary in the way that matters for science, and not in any other way. The tire salvage yard had soil chemistry that was, by any normal agricultural standard, essentially dead. Heavy metal concentrations that would require decades of remediation to bring back to anything usable for biological purposes. The mill runoff pond had organochlorine levels that the EPA had been trying to address for 11 years without meaningful progress. The remediation site outside Medford was the most contaminated of the 3. A former chemical manufacturing facility whose operators had discovered, sometime in the late 1980s, that the cheapest form of waste disposal was to put the waste in the ground on site, and whose subsequent owners had inherited a legal liability and a remediation challenge that had been in litigation since before I had finished my doctorate. Each site had been inside the root system's advance corridor. Each site had been avoided. The root mass had come to the property line, touched the boundary soil, and turned. I collected my samples and drove back to the synthesis trailer, and did not look at the displacement camp on the return route because I needed to think clearly, and looking at it again was not going to help with that. The synthesis work has a rhythm to it once you understand what you are doing. Concentration first. Reducing the soil samples to their active chemical components through a series of extraction and filtration steps. Removing the inert material, retaining the specific compound families that I had identified in the spectrometry analysis as being responsible for the root system's avoidance behavior. Then, stabilization. The active compounds in soil saturation form were not stable enough for delivery at depth. They would degrade before reaching 60 meters. So I needed a carrier medium that would hold the activity through the injection process and release it on contact with the soil chemistry at the target depth. Then the delivery vehicle, the modified agricultural applicator, which was designed to push liquid fertilizer through hardpan, but was adaptable with Joe's engineering to push my compound through root mass to the depth I needed. Concentration step took 18 hours. The stabilization step took another 12. I slept for 4 hours in the trailer, somewhere in the middle of the stabilization process, and woke up with spectrometer readings on my laptop screen and a crick in my neck and frame, sitting outside the trailer's door with 2 cups of something that was technically coffee in the same way that what Chen made was technically coffee. "It's the only thing I know how to do that helps," he said, handing me one. I took it. It tasted terrible. "Is that an apology?" "No." He looked at his own cup. "An apology would be insufficient. It's just coffee." I drank it and went back to the stabilization step. Frame sat outside the trailer for another hour without being asked to leave. And then he went in and helped Taylor with the logistics mapping, which needed a second person. And that was all either of us said about it. There was a period, on the 3rd day of synthesis work, when I was not sure the compound would stabilize correctly. The carrier medium I was using, a modified agricultural polymer base that Taylor had requisitioned from a university chemistry supply, was interacting with one of the organochlorine fractions in a way that was destabilizing the whole mixture. Two batches went wrong. I ran the spectrometry on the second failed batch and sat with the results for 40 minutes, which is a long time to sit with something when the displacement camp is 40 miles north and the ground is still vibrating under the trailer. Kate knocked on the door at the end of those 40 minutes. She had a different camera angle on the Medford site footage from day 2 that I had not seen. A drone pass that showed the soil boundary in detail, the exact line at which the root mass had stopped, and in the drone's thermal imaging, the specific temperature differential at the contamination boundary that indicated the root tissue's metabolic response to the chemical interface. The thermal data showed me what I needed to see. The organochlorine fraction I had been trying to stabilize was not the primary active compound. It was a secondary one. The primary disruption was coming from a specific heavy metal chelate compound that the mill runoff had deposited in concentrations I had not isolated, specifically because I had been focused on the organochlorines. I had been concentrating the wrong fraction. "How did you know I needed this?" I asked. Kate shrugged. "I didn't. I was reviewing footage. You looked like you were stuck." She paused. "Were you stuck?" "I was using the wrong fraction." I closed the thermal data and opened my sample analysis. Me 6 hours. She left. I worked. 6 hours later, the third batch was stable. I think about that moment sometimes. About Kate, standing outside a synthesis trailer in the middle of a disaster zone reviewing footage. Because she had noticed, I looked stuck, and the piece of data that was incidentally in the footage she happened to be reviewing being the piece of data I needed. I do not think it was luck, exactly. Kate documents everything with methodical attention to detail. And methodical attention to detail generates data, and when you have enough data, some of it will be the data you need. The correlation between competence and fortuitous timing is higher than most people account for. The night before we went in, Taylor and I sat outside the operations trailer and went over the approach one more time. He asked me again what my confidence was. 60% that the delivery works as planned, I said. 20% that it works but not completely. No disruption without full collapse, meaning the root system degrades but doesn't stop. 20% that it doesn't work at all. And the 20 where it doesn't work. We know more than we did. We find another approach. He was quiet for a moment. The night was cold and clear, and the vibration from the root system was a constant presence. The ground's pulse, the rhythm of something vast and patient, working its way toward whatever it was aimed at, toward the displacement camps, toward Portland, toward the coast and the ocean, where the growth would hit salt water, and the pressure from the root mass would begin driving towards tsunamis, which was the calculation that had been making the emergency management, people's expressions very specific, for the past week. "What would they have done?" Taylor asked. Not looking at me, looking at the sky, the Veth. If it had worked, they'd have sent nothing. That's the thing, they don't follow up. The seed does the whole job. In 40 years, maybe 50, the root system would have replaced every living biological system in the soil, every native plant, every soil organism. The food chain collapses from the bottom. Then you start getting the cascading extinctions through every organism that depends on the soil biology, which is functionally everything. By year 60-70, the surface biosphere is mostly gone. What's left is the root network, covering the planet. And then nothing, for a while. The Veth are patient. They come back in a few centuries when the terraforming chemistry is right. I considered. If they come back, he looked at me. The preservation library is very large, I said. They have 11 worlds already in various stages of processing. I do not know how high a priority any individual planet is on their schedule. Taylor did not say anything to that. There was probably nothing to say. After a moment, he stood up and went back inside to finish the logistics review, and I sat outside a while longer in the cold with the ground vibrating under me and thought about patience. The kind that operates in centuries, the kind that doesn't need to hurry, because it has been doing this long enough to know that the outcomes come eventually, and about the specific human response to that kind of patience, which is to not wait for it, We had not waited for it. We had synthesized a compound from our own poisoned ground in 4 days with agricultural equipment and a university spectrometer and Joe's mechanical improvisation and Kate's camera footage and Frame's anomaly notes and Taylor's logistics. And we had driven into the root mass at 2 in the morning in cold suits smelling of stored rubber. And we had stood at a monitoring well while a root tendril assessed the galvanized casing for 7 seconds. And we had waited it out, and we had done the job, and the ancient patient thing in the ground had stopped. That is what happened. That is all of it. As completely as I can tell it, and stay honest about the parts, I am still not certain I understand. I have been telling versions of it in various levels of classification and various levels of completeness since that Tuesday when I filed the incident report and the FEMA clerk stamped it closed. The stamp was not wrong. It is closed. In the ways that matter most. The root mass is gone. The soil is recovering. The displaced people came home. The road crews are still working on the highway subgrade and will be for another year or two. It is closed in the ways that matter most. The ways that matter second most are still open, and the audit of the Class 9 holdings is ongoing, and the consortium is being. The word Taylor used, in one of his 8-word messages, cooperative, by which he means they are cooperating at precisely the speed they consider appropriate, which is slower than I would choose and faster than I had feared. I walk the perimeter of the old affected zone sometimes on weekends when the field work is caught up and the weather is clear. The ground cover is coming back well now. In some sections you would not know, if you did not already know. The soil is settled, the grass is full, the wildflowers that the affected zone had not seen for 2 years are back in the southern meadows, the same ones they always were, growing exactly where they always grew. In other sections, you can still see the shape of what was here, if you know what you are looking at. The slight irregularity in the terrain, where the primary root ridges ran. The areas where the soil composition is still recovering, where the plants grow paler and sparser than the surrounding ground. The places where I put sampling stakes to track the recovery and come back every month to pull cores and record the chemistry. I know this ground better than I have ever known any ground in my life. I know what is in it, and what has been in it, and what it took to bring it back to this. It is, in the particular way that damaged things that have survived can be, very good ground. Put my hand on it sometimes, on the way back to the station, just for a moment, just to be certain. It is still. It has been still for a long time now. That is enough.